Good afternoon. So I am not a musician, but I'm honored to be sitting in front of the singers, amidst the music, as I tell you the story behind the song that we just heard. So it took place in Scotland in the summer of 1746, and Bonnie Prince Charles, we'll call him by his proper title, that he would call his proper title, he had been defeated. He had been unsuccessful in claiming the throne of England, but the thing was that he had not yet managed to leave Scotland. So the land was divided between those who wanted to capture him, those who wanted to help him escape, and those who really didn't want to have much of anything to do with it at all. So the story begins in 1746 on a Friday night, Friday, June 20th. Flora MacDonald, 24 years old, was sleeping in a little house above a loch that belonged to her brother. It was midnight. And suddenly her eyes flew open and she saw a man at the end of her bed. And he spoke and he said, "Come downstairs, we need to talk." And she realized it was her cousin Neil. So she went downstairs and he told her, "Flora, you will be the one to save Prince Charles." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I should pause for a second to tell you, because you will wonder by the end of this if this story could possibly be true, and I assure you, everything I'm going to tell you is taken straight from the historical record. So Neil answered, he said, your stepfather has a plan. Read this. And he handed her a letter. And in the letter, it explained that Flora was going to travel with her cousin Neil and Betty Burke back to her mother's home on the Isle of Skye because things were just too dangerous. They were out in the Outer Hebrides, so these islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. And she needed to go be with her mother. And Flora looked at this letter and she said, "Who is Betty Burke?" "That's the thing," said Neil. "What we're going to do is we're going to take Prince Charles, we're going to dress him as an Irish maid named Betty Burke, and you're going to take her to your mother. And when we get to the Isle of Skye, someone else will take him, and he'll go on to France, and he will be saved." And Flora said, "Have you lost your mind?" "No." And he said, "It's a perfect plan." And she said no, and he said yes, and she said no, and he said yes, and she said no. And he said, "Why don't you talk to the prince?" And the door opened, boom, and in stepped a tall, well-built man with the distinctive oval face of Prince Charles. And he said, "Miss Flora, I will be forever indebted to you for saving me and bringing me back to France." And he bowed very, very deeply and kissed her hand, and who could say no to that? So, a week later, Flora has acquired traveling papers for herself, for Neil, and for Betty Burke, because as everyone was searching for Prince Charles, you needed to have your paperwork in order. And she also had sewn with her own hands a set of clothing, a set of improbably large clothing for Miss Betty Burke. With a hat to cover her features, an apron, full petticoats, and a very large dress of calico with a nice subtle floral pattern. So on Saturday, June 28th, the three of them go down to the shore where a boat awaits them. There's a captain, 4 men to row. She hands the clothes to Prince Charles. He puts them on, and Betty Burke is born. But then Prince Charles takes his pistols and he starts lifting up the skirts, and Flora said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, my pistols, I'm going to tuck them in underneath the petticoats." And she said, "You can't do that. If anyone go find the pistols. Oh, no, you're not an Irish maid. And he said, if they're looking that thoroughly, it won't be the pistols. Flora laughed too, but she said no pistols. So reluctantly, he left the pistols behind. The three of them got into the boat, and they began to, and the rowing began. They set off. The Isle of Skye was only 30 nautical miles away. They could make it by the next morning. What could go wrong? So, as it turns out, as soon as they got out, the mist began to come in, obscuring their ability to see the stars or where they should be going. And then the clouds came in, and then the rain started. And Flora began to realize that probably quite a lot could go wrong with this plan. But Prince Charles said, "Miss, never fear." And he began to sing to her songs about his triumphant return to the throne. He didn't write them himself. They had been made by other people. And he sang all through the night until finally she fell asleep. And the boat was left to drift, thinking that it was better to follow the current than to risk rowing in the wrong direction. The sun came up, the rain stopped, the mist parted, and there was the Isle of Skye. They were ever so slightly off from where they had intended to land, but really it could work. And so they got to shore. They beached the boat, everyone stepped out, they stretched, they looked around, and there, just down the coast, was a group of militiamen out searching for Prince Charles. And they were close enough that the militiamen, they could hear them yelling, "Stop, you there, stop!" And Flora said, "Go!" And they said, "Stop!" And Flora said, "Go!" And they ran to the boat, and they pushed it back into the water, and Flora was thinking again of the very many things that could go wrong, but Prince Charles said, "Never fear, miss. Look, we are already on the water. They have to carry their boat across the sand. We will be well out of sight before they ever get to sea." And indeed, he was right. They got around the corner, they made their way up, they got to the house of a Lady MacDonald, who was a distant relative of Flora's. And she was the one who was going to take Prince Charles and send him on the next leg of his journey. Flora looked up at the house and thought, what could go wrong? And so she left Charles as Betty Burke behind, and she went to knock on the door. And Lady MacDonald answered, and she said, "No, no, no, you have to go. Don't bring him in. Look who's at breakfast." And she looked in, and there was an English captain. And she said, whose men were camped just outside, preparing to search for Prince Charles. So word was sent down to Charles that he, as Betty Burke, should head on with Neil. There was apparently an inn not too terribly far away. They go to the inn, Flora would wait, have breakfast, follow them, and they would meet at the inn, and there would be another captain who could take him on. So Flora went back in, dined with the captain. Everything seemed fine, and she thought, what could go wrong? Betty was already long gone. She got on a horse. There were some servants who were traveling with her to keep everything proper. And they were riding along. What Flora didn't know is that she kind of knew, but she didn't factor in that Prince Charles was a very gallant and gregarious man. And so as he and Neil were going along, he had to bow to everyone who was going by, which struck them as strange because he was supposed to be women would curtsy. And he was a very boisterous man, and so he would hoist up his petticoats when he was walking along the road and let them drag in the puddles as he walked through, and was generally attracting a lot of unwelcome attention. And so Flora and her maid caught up with him. And Flora urged the horses on. She said, we really did. So went past them as fast as she possibly could, but still they attracted the attention of the maid, who actually commented, it is is in the record. I've never seen such an impudent woman. That's either a man in a dress or a woman from Ireland. She's from Ireland, said Flora. I'd say she's definitely from Ireland. Finally, they continue on. Once again, it starts raining in Scotland in the summertime, and they get to the inn. Flora is there, Neil is there, Betty Burke has been left behind, and Prince Charles had re-emerged because that simply was less trouble and really attracted less attention. What could go wrong? Well, Flora was ready to go, Neil was ready to go, and Charles said, why don't we stay here? It's so wet out there and it's so nice inside. Let's have something nice to eat, nice to drink. And so they sat and they feasted, but finally, almost midnight, he agrees to go down to the shore. And so Prince Charles and Neil and Flora MacDonald head down to the shore. It's the moment of parting. And Prince Charles, wearing a well-stocked tartan, with whiskey on one side, brandy on the other, some clean shirts here, and a roasted chicken hanging on the other side, bowed gallantly and said, Miss, I hope that we shall meet again in my royal court. And with that, he got onto the boat and sailed off. And as for Flora, she returned to the inn and slept very soundly, knowing that from here on out, she would not have to be the one to ask, what could go wrong? Thank you.